Hello everyone, this is Scarzig, and welcome back to Duelyst 101. In this episode, we're going to be doing a quick rundown on a few common Lyonar threats that you're going to be seeing on the ladder. So, first things first, I wanted to go over Tempest. Now, this is a card that I wasn't sure I actually wanted to include at first because at higher levels of play, you don't see it a lot. But as a beginning player, I figured that this is going to be a lot more common, and it is something that you are going to need to watch out for. Tempest is a 2-mana spell that deals 2 damage to everything. This does include ally and enemy units as well as generals. So everybody on the board right now takes 2 damage. And this can be pretty strong if you're trying to play a swarmy list. And I know that, again, at lower levels of the ladder, new players are going to be trying to just flood the board with as many minions as possible and beat their opponent down. So if you end up playing too many small units, then Tempest can really bite you. And it's important, especially in games like that, to calculate the potential for that extra 2 damage that they might need to finish you off, or maybe finish off one of your big units. Generally, this just sort of plays into how to calculate for AoE in general. Is if you think that they have it in their hand, or if you know that if they were to have it, it would be really, really bad for you to say, oh man, they can clear my whole board with Tempest, maybe try to hold back on summoning a unit or two, just so you have something to follow up with if they do end up using the Tempest. Because a card like this, it does, again, it damages their own stuff, and it's 2 mana that they're spending on this spell rather than on summoning a minion to the board, right? So you want to make sure that if they are forced to cast the Tempest, that they aren't getting too much value out of it. And so moving on to the next card, we do have the ArcLight Regalia. This is a legendary card, so you aren't going to be seeing it too often, but this is one of the cards that new players will absolutely get destroyed by. This is a card that you kind of have to learn to play around. It's a 4-mana artifact, and the way it works is first of all, the enemy general is going to get +2 attack. So that's very important to note, that the enemy general is going to be able to start killing your minions and start hitting you really, really hard. And the first time that they take damage each turn, it prevents 2 of that damage. So if when it's your turn, right, and you're trying to break their artifact, you're trying to clear the ArcLight Regalia, if you don't have a straight up card that counters it somehow, something that just instantly destroys an artifact, you're gonna have to play very, very smart and figure out a way to deal enough separate instances of damage to break the ArcLight Regalia. And honestly, dealing with ArcLight Regalia could probably be a video in of itself. But we're just going to go over a couple quick pointers. With ArcLight Regalia, because it prevents 2 damage, that means that if your general, whose base attack is 2, is attacked by the enemy when they have ArcLight Regalia equipped, when your general attempts to counterattack, the opponent will not take any damage, so they can start trading into you for free. If they kill a minion that only has 2 or less base attack, the minion's counterattack will be blocked by the ArcLight Regalia. So this allows them to attack you and not take any damage back, and it allows them to kill your smaller minions and not take any damage back. The way you want to go about breaking an ArcLight Regalia is, if you are able to, first of all, you need to just back off and play defensively. Start getting minions on the board if you can, so that you have a bunch of separate bodies, a bunch of separate instances of available damage to get through the ArcLight Regalia. Artifacts break after the enemy equipped with them, the enemy general, takes 3 instances of damage. And so because ArcLight Regalia negates 2 points of damage from the first instance they take, there is a chance for it to completely negate your first attempt at doing damage to them at all. And so to go through the ArcLight Regalia, you need to, 1, make that first instance of damage be from a source of 3 or more. That way, the two damage is negated, but 1 damage still goes through and takes a charge off of the artifact. And then once that happens, after that first instance of damage occurs, every single instance of damage, every attack, every spell, every effect that does damage to the enemy general will continue to hit for their full amount. So the most efficient way to deal with Regalia is to have something with 3 or more attack deal that first instance. That way it eats through the shield effect and still takes the charge off the artifact, and then you just attack. And this can be accomplished with Wraithlings or something like that as well. If you just have a bunch of small separate instances of damage, you can just have the first one basically deal nothing, right? It's fully absorbed, and then as long as you have enough follow-up pings of damage, then that will clear the ArcLight Regalia. So that is something that you want to prepare for when your opponent does play the ArcLight Regalia. You want to make sure you do have minions on board. And it's important to try to not be too slow when you're breaking ArcLight Regalia, because if your opponent equips 2 ArcLight Regalia, then things start to get pretty gross, because then they're up to 6 attack. And it is important to note that when ArcLight Regalia is, when they have 2 of them equipped, they're just, the instance is not, they stack, but don't, oh my god, how do I describe this? When 2 copies of ArcLight Regalia are equipped, they block 1 instance of up to 4 damage, but they don't block the 2 damage once and then another instance of 2 damage again. It just reinforces that initial block of damage, I guess. So it becomes a bit harder to break when they get 2 equipped, but that's very rare, just something that you want to watch out for and be more proactive about. But moving on, Divine Bond is a much more common threat that you're going to be seeing from Lyonar. This is a core set, like basic set card, so every Lyonar player is going to have it. And this is a 3-mana spell that adds a minion's health total to its attack, and then it just beefs the opponent up, the enemy minion up, to deal massive damage. So a couple caveats to Divine Bond. It does only add the current health to the attack value of the minion, not their maximum health. So to sort of weaken the potential power of a Divine Bond, you can attack the minion a couple times to soften it up, and it makes Divine Bond not as good of a target. But the problem with Divine Bond is that if you don't have the resources on board to soften up a minion, or you can't get away from that minion, then Divine Bond can just absolutely destroy you. You have to be aware, especially in lower ranks of play, where Divine Bond where I should even just say Lyonar's minions aren't going to be answered as efficiently. You have to be aware that if they summon something like a Primus Shield Master or a Hailstone Golem, other common minions that you're going to be seeing, even Dancing Blades, minions that all have 6 HP, that's a pretty tanky pool in and of itself, but then they have potential to just play another 3-mana spell on top of that, and then give them additional attack, and then hit you for really, really big damage. And they can also do, in later stages of the game, they can do double Divine Bond, right? On 6 mana, they can cast 2 copies of Divine Bond, and it will stack. So you can get some pretty ridiculously big minions, and they will attack. So it's important that when you're playing against Lyonar in general, to hold on to your removal, or to, if you can't directly deal with a minion that is a potential Divine Bond target, to at least sometimes trade into it a little bit to weaken its HP pool, and so that it doesn't have, it becomes less of a powerful Divine Bond target. Furthermore, Lyonar players, what they will do is they'll play the minion, see how you react to it, and then they'll just play Divine Bond the following turn. Very rarely are you going to see players play a minion and then Divine Bond it in the same turn, simply because a minion with Divine Bond already cast on it can be removed with just any sort of spell that instantly kills a minion, or if you have Dispel from like Lightbender or Ephemeral Shroud, then you just erase the Divine Bond buff, and then you can just destroy the minion. So Divine Bond is going to be something that you need to be aware of at all times when playing against Lyonar. Even if it looks like a deck that doesn't run it most of the time. But the reason Divine Bond is so, we're going to skip Holy Immolation because after talking about Divine Bond, it's important to talk about Ironcliff Guardian. There we go. Camera, refocus. The Ironcliff Guardian is one of the mainstays of Lyonar. In certain decks in higher reaches of the ladder, they have like Tempo Archeon that runs like a more aggressive list that will close out the game early. Sometimes doesn't run the Ironcliff Guardian, but Ironcliff Guardian, even in those decks, can sometimes find a spot as like a 1 or 2 copy. But at any rate, Ironcliff Guardian is a 5-mana, 3/10 airdrop provoke unit. What this means is that Ironcliff Guardian can be summoned anywhere on the board, and it has provoke. So if it is summoned next to you, you cannot move until the Ironcliff Guardian is dealt with in some way. You'll have to dispel it to get rid of the provoke, or you'll just have to outright kill it. At lower ranks of play, Ironcliff Guardian's 10 HP makes it a formidable foe, and when it is combined with Divine Bond, suddenly it gains 10 attack, right? And then it just becomes a 13-10, and then it just slaps you around. Double Divine Bond gives it 23 attack, and then it just goes in and kills you, right? So Ironcliff Guardian is going to be the bane of the existence for a lot of new players, and I've died to this thing more times I can count. Sometimes they summon the Ironcliff Guardian specifically to be defensive. They might not have the Divine Bond, but you have to assume that when they play Ironcliff Guardian that they do have a Divine Bond to follow up with it, and that they could potentially kill you. And so when it comes to Ironcliff Guardian, you have to prioritize anticipating this minion, right? The reason we're going over these threats is so that you can prepare and possibly anticipate them. So you already have the cards in hand, or you already have a game plan about how you're going to deal with this minion when it appears. And so Ironcliff Guardian, what you want to do is when you are crafting your opening hand against Lyonar, you want to make sure you have your turn 1 play, or whatever. You make sure you have your opening play and a removal spell of some kind. Something that can instantly kill a large minion or take its threat away. Vanar has Aspect of the Ravager, which would just transform it into a 3/3. Lyonar has Martyrdom, which just instantly destroys a minion, and then it just gives its HP to the opponent. And trust me, giving your opponent 10 HP feels bad, but it's better to give them 10 HP than for you to potentially take 13 damage the next turn, right? So don't be afraid to use Martyrdom on Ironcliff Guardian. Just get it out of the way, and then and then just continue with the game as it goes on from there. Songhai has, Onyx Bear Seal, which is one of their only answers to Ironcliff Guardian. Like every faction does have some way to deal with the Ironcliff Guardian. The trick is to make sure that you are prepared for it. Songhai has, again, Onyx Bear Seal. Magmar has Egg Morph, which will transform it into a 0/1 egg that you can then kill. It also has Natural Selection, that if Ironcliff Guardian happens to be the only minion on the board, aka the minion with the least attack on the board, the Natural Selection will just kill it immediately. Furthermore, Abyssian does have Demonic Lure, so they can take the Ironcliff Guardian and just deal 1 damage to it and then move it over to the corner or something out of the way to get away from the Ironcliff Guardian. Lyonar typically isn't able to move their minions back into position if they are dislocated like that. Relocated. Or I suppose they both mean the same thing. Relocated like that. And so again, Ironcliff Guardian, dealing with it comes down to preparation. And if you don't have a removal spell in your hand and you have a couple minions on the board against the Ironcliff Guardian, I think it's important to just trade into the Ironcliff Guardian. I know that you're like, oh man, I'm sacrificing my whole board into this minion. But again, it's important to just deal with this threat rather than have it, gambling and then have your opponent deal 13 damage to you. Because after they've buffed the Ironcliff Guardian, the Divine Bond, that's a permanent buff. It'll just remain and have 13 attack. And then suddenly, instead of dealing with a 310, after it punches you in the face, you're dealing with a 13-8. And so, that becomes sometimes harder to deal with, where normally you'd be able to fight it and preserve some of your board. A 13-8 is going to just devastate anything else that attacks into it. So, if Ironcliff Guardian is summoned and your general is the only thing available to attack it, depending on positioning, depending on what the current board state is, if you attack it to drop it down to a 3-8, and then it gets Divine Bond cast on it the next turn, it still gets that attack buff and hits you right back. You end up taking the same amount of damage anyway, right? Because you take that 3 on the counter attack, and then you just and then it just gets buffed up and you get hit anyway for that damage. So it's important to have minions on the board, and if your general is the only one available to attack it, then that means you shouldn't attack it, right? That's the point where if you don't have a removal and you don't have a board and they play Ironcliff Guardian, you have to basically pray that they don't have the Divine Bond and try to replace and fish through your deck for a removal spell before the Ironcliff Guardian becomes too much. But the best, how do they say, the best tonic is preparation, or however the saying goes. So to back up a little bit, we glossed over Holy Immolation. This is the tried and true, much complained about AoE spell of Lyonar, and even people to this day still say that it's overpowered, right, and that it should be nerfed. Holy Immolation, a 4-mana spell that restores 4 health to a friendly minion and deals 4 damage to all enemies around it. And so this spell ends up dealing face damage and then punishes you for softening up a minion and then not finishing it off. I talked a little bit about when you're going up against Divine Bond, in order to make Divine Bond not such a great target for your opponent, is to try to deal some damage to the minion so that the Divine Bond doesn't buff it for as much. But then Holy Immolation throws that on its head, right? Where they can say, okay, well, I'm just going to heal this minion and deal a bunch of AoE damage to you. And so the trick with Holy Immolation is basically, if they get that 4 damage AoE off onto your board, you have to prepare to make sure they don't take out all of your minions. When you are fighting against the enemy general, you have to make sure you aren't fully surrounding the opponent. Actually, let me see if I can pop over here to the grid. I wasn't planning on using the grid for this video, but I think that when we're talking about Holy Immolation, this could probably be a video in and of itself, but I basically want to just touch on what this will mean for you in terms of implication. So let's say your opponent has a minion here, right? And you're like, oh crap, I can't deal with this minion, but it's not a great Divine Bond target. Like maybe it's just something with 5 HP or whatever. You attack it, and you're like, okay, well, my opponent could potentially have Holy Immolation next turn if they have 4 mana available. And so you want to make sure they can't destroy your board. So if you summon your minions back here away from it, then this unit just walks to this spot, Holy Immolates, and hits all 3 of these, right? So you can't really do that. You could play like this, and then the minion in the far back will survive, but then it's so far away from the fight that it can't do anything. Typically, the best anti-Holy Immolation formation would be something like this, right? Where if you summon 2 units, you want to summon them in this diagonal formation, and what this does is that the Holy Immolation will only hit you and one of your minions, and you still get to have something on the board to help you defeat the Holy Immolation target. Furthermore, on 6 mana, your opponent can just summon a 2 mana minion plus Holy Immolation, right? 2 mana plus 4 mana for 6, and that's a huge play that Lyonar relies on to come back onto the board. And so if you see that your opponent is going to have 6 mana available to them next turn, and you want to develop a board, just summon your minions diagonally like this ahead of time. And so that way, if they want to do a Holy Immolation, they could potentially only kill one of your minions, and you preserve your whole board. And if you are pressuring your opponent, right, let's say that you are like right in your opponent's face, and you're like, I want to, I really want to push my advantage here. And if you summon your minions like this to like completely box them in to like fight them next turn, the enemy will just walk away, will just walk out from this spot, summon a minion on this tile, and then Holy Immolate and destroy your board. So that's something that you always need to respect on 6 mana. So bit of a tangent there, but again, Holy Immolation I think could just be a video all on its own. But getting back to the main course of Lyonar threats, I also wanted to quickly touch on Scintilla. This is a card from the Rise of the Bloodbound expansion that you aren't going to be seeing a lot of because, especially at lower reaches of the ladder, you aren't... players typically don't have access to those cards right away. But I just wanted to point out that Scintilla is a fantastic minion. It's a staple in Lyonar at higher levels of play. And that 3 health that it restores to the general when they cast their Bloodbound spell is huge. And so Scintilla is a priority threat. If you think that, oh, well, I'll let the Scintilla just sit there and I'm going to try to just develop my own board, there's a chance that your opponent could play a second Scintilla and then suddenly they're healing for 6. Or if you back off, if you give up the opportunity to kill Scintilla and you want to do something else instead, and then they play an Ironcliff Guardian, and then suddenly you're provoked, you're locked down, you have to refocus your efforts on dealing with the Ironcliff Guardian, then Scintilla is just waiting in the back where you can't reach it, and it's just healing the enemy whenever they cast their Bloodbound spell. So just as a quick ender to the video, if you ever do see a Scintilla, don't underestimate it. That 3 healing is enormous. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of Duelyst 101, and I'll see you in the next one.